Thank you for joining us today for Science, Policy, and Conserving the Northern Spotted Owl. I'm Steve Holmer, Senior Policy Advisor for American Bird Conservancy. This chart shows American Bird Conservancy's Strategic Conservation Framework, which says that protecting endangered species from extinction is the highest conservation priority, followed by restoring habitats. And this is a particular concern here because there appears to be a potential conflict between the needs of the spotted owl and efforts ongoing to restore the forest in the Northwest. Before joining American Bird Conservancy, I had worked for conservation of national forests for the Wilderness Society and American Lands Alliance, which provided me an opportunity to travel extensively and visit national forests in 26 different states. Here's an image from the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest in Washington State. The forests of the Pacific Northwest contain most of the remaining intact old-growth forest in the continental U.S. Per acre, these forests store more carbon than even tropical forests. In addition to providing habitat for threatened owls and other species such as the marbled murrelet and iconic salmon are also found in the region. Another 600 species also rely on the ancient forests. Hundreds of Northwest communities also rely on clean water supplies that originate out of the old-growth forest watersheds. However, much of what remains is in very small fragments. Restoring large blocks of old growth is essential for owl recovery, and under the Northwest Forest Plan, stands older than 80 years are protected with the management goal to allow it to become old growth. The northern spotted owl is an indicator of the health of the old-growth ecosystem, and it continues to decline at about 2.9% per year across its entire range and 7% per year in Washington. It's estimated that there are fewer than 4,000 pairs left, and the risk of extinction is high unless the trend line is changed. Downgrading to endangered status is warranted. Large areas of older, structurally complex forests provide the habitat necessary to support viable populations of northern spotted owl. Owls tend to choose older forests for nesting and roosting and foraging, and to date approximately 85% of the owl's habitat has been lost or degraded by fire, logging, and development. Over 1 million acres of suitable owl habitat on federal lands remains unprotected from logging. Spotted owls are found in the low to mid-elevation mature forests with dense canopy. They prefer forests of Douglas fir with complex vegetation at multiple levels and are often found near streams or other water sources. Because spotted owls typically do not cross brushy or clear-cut areas, they prefer large expanses of undisturbed mature forest. A single pair of spotted owls requires 2,000 to 5,000 acres of contiguous forest. The conservation history of the northern spotted owls offers an important lesson that should help guide current decision-making. Agency scientists confirmed the owl's decline in connection to old-growth forest habitat by 1983, but instead of taking steps to moderate habitat loss, a series of legislative riders allowed for record logging levels in owl habitat from 1983 to 1990. Listing of the species and the defeat of the rider offered in 1991 opened the courthouse door to litigation over logging in owl habitat. Judge William Dwyer then ruled the Forest Service and BLM had systematically and deliberately failed to abide by wildlife protection laws. The management abuses were so extreme, Judge Dwyer shut down the region's timber sale program on federal lands. This led to President Bill Clinton's Forest Summit and the development of the Northwest Forest Plan, a multi-species conservation plan that protects the owl as well as the threatened marbled murrelet and Pacific salmon stocks. The salvage logging rider of 1995 to 96 suspended most environmental laws to allow the agencies to address forest health emergencies. Instead, the public saw hundreds of old growth and roadless area timber sales be offered for sale, including dozens that had been previously ruled illegal by federal courts. The public was outraged. Pressure on the Clinton administration led to Secretary Dan Glickman canceling over 150 roadless area projects, but most of the old growth sales were logged. Since then, we've seen regular efforts made in Congress and by the Bush administration to expedite logging by weakening or eliminating environmental protection and public involvement. Unfortunately, the history of management abuse in the Northwest continued. The Western Oregon Plan Revision, a BLM plan approved at the end of 2008, proposed a 400% increase in the amount of old-growth logging allowed in matrix lands, and to eliminate forest protections for owls, murrelets, and riparian areas. Independent scientific reviews, including those by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and National Marine Fisheries Service, found the plan would likely cause significant harm to the forest, water quality, and threatened species. The WOPR planned for the elimination of hundreds of known owl nesting sites and hundreds of known nesting sites of the threatened marbled murrelet. The BLM's flawed analysis concluded that owls and murrelets would actually have benefited from this logging. The BLM refused, though, to consult on this plan with the Fish and Wildlife Service under the Endangered Species Act, and as a result, a federal judge ruled the plan was illegal in March 2012. The legacies of past active management and agency misconduct have engendered mistrust with the public, and should be considered whenever new proposals for active management are considered. Active management is not free. Quite often roads have to be built, and there already remains an excess of logging roads on the National Forest and an estimated $10 billion backlog for road maintenance. The impacts of this mismanagement of the public lands are reduced water quality, increased water filtration costs for downstream communities, and diminished fisheries and aquatic ecosystems. After the Bush administration's critical habitat and recovery plans were thrown out, new plans were initiated under court order with a November 15 deadline for the critical habitat designation. In the plan, additional habitat protection is needed to reverse the owl's decline and to allow for eventual recovery. Given past mismanagement and continuing pressure to raid these forests to meet economic needs and to pay for local government services, it is essential that firm protections, such as the system of late successional reserves provided by the Northwest Forest Plan, remain in place. The critical habitat designation will guide future management changes in the region, and we anticipate that all of the land management plans in the region will be amended to conform to this new critical habitat designation. One of the bases for the critical habitat designation is the owl recovery plan completed last year, and it did confirm that additional owl habitat protection is needed, and included several recovery actions, 10 and 32, that require the high-quality owl habitat found in the matrix lands be conserved. However, the plan also has a number of shortcomings related to active management and the idea of eliminating reserves on the east side. In the draft peer review, the Wildlife Society, Ecological Society of America, and American Ornithologists Union concluded that there is a lack of scientific support for active management in owl habitat. There is currently no peer-reviewed study showing spotted owls benefit from the proposed logging treatments, while others show short-term harm to owl and prey base from thinning with declines lasting up to 30 years. Given the 2.9% annual decline in the owl's population, it's not acceptable to allow for short-term losses of owls in the hope that improved habitat conditions might prove beneficial to the species someday in the distant future. But this is what the critical habitat plan is calling for, and getting back to our conservation framework, we do think that the needs of the endangered species need to take priority over the perceived needs of the broader habitat. That brings us to the proposed critical habitat designation. The public has an opportunity to comment on this until June the 6th. We've heard that this is likely to now be extended till July the 7th. The proposal identifies sufficient amounts of owl habitat, but fails to adequately protect it from adverse modification, and in fact encourages harmful adverse modification of owl habitat through unproven thinning and forestry techniques. The plan marks a significant departure from the standards and guidelines of the Northwest Forest Plan, weakens habitat protection for the threatened owl, and does not reflect the best available science. Under the draft rule, the only lands that are protected are high-quality owl habitat, and that is only generally and to the extent necessary, which suggests that even the oldest, highest quality owl habitat could be logged under certain circumstances. At this point, I think it is worth taking a look back at the Northwest Forest Plan to kind of contrast it with what's being proposed. The Northwest Forest Plan was a significant environmental achievement of the Clinton administration that we believe should be built upon and extended upon by the Obama administration. This is the best policy from a forest and wildlife management perspective, and we believe it's the only mechanism available that provides legal certainty and can ensure that an adequate regulatory mechanism remains in place to conserve and recover wide-ranging threatened species in the region. During the Bush administration, repeated attempts were made to reduce or eliminate protections of the Northwest Forest Plan, including survey and manage and the aquatic conservation strategy. The Northern Spotted Owl Critical Habitat Designation and Owl Recovery Plan offered by the Bush administration were heavily criticized as scientifically flawed and motivated by a desire to boost logging. A later investigation by the Department of Interior's Inspector General confirmed that political interference had prevented the Fish and Wildlife Service from preparing a scientifically sound recovery plan. This contributed to the plan and the critical habitat designation being thrown out by the court. When you look at the Forest Service's review of the Northwest Forest Plan, they found that overall it's working, that it is in fact protecting species and habitats as intended. The plan was designed with the idea that owl populations would in fact continue to decline until about the mid-century, but then as an additional habitat came online, they would stabilize and eventually recover. We're very, very concerned right now about the recovery piece of that because we're concerned that the habitat that is supposed to be coming online may not be available. In the critical habitat rule, it points out that the Northwest Plan has been successful in conserving and recruitment of late successional forest and associated species. But then it proceeds to recommend dismantling the plan based on two main justifications: that commercial timber harvest from matrix lands has been insufficient, and the lack of active restoration in areas that may contain uncharacteristically high risk of severe fire, or in moist forests where early sterile habitats are lacking. In the plan's discussion on reserves, it offers both points of view, but then specifically does not say a system of reserves is required to conserve the owl, only that old-growth forests and trees should be retained. Several other references in the test suggest critical habitat should not be a reserve or hands-off area. Land managers can take this as guidance to eliminate the reserves under the Northwest Forest Plan, which have much more stringent standards and guidelines protecting all stands over 80 years, not just the high-quality owl habitat. When you look at the timber sale volume coming out under the Northwest Forest Plan, we believe that it has been proving itself sustainable and meeting the volume targets that have been budgeted by Congress. A lot of people have been screaming for more timber, but apparently nobody has been willing to pay for it. Because when you carefully look at how much budget has been actually approved by Congress and the administration, they've provided for 4.6 billion board feet from 2003 to 2010, and the agency produced 4.5 billion board feet, or 96% of the finance total. So the notion that the agencies are simply not able to produce timber is simply not true. It's a matter of how much timber does Congress and the administration really want to pay for. In addition to this, we're seeing an explosion of exports from private forests. And 2 billion board feet of logs and lumber were exported from the West Coast in 2010. In 2011, it topped 3 billion, and we expect to see about the same or more this year. There is absolutely no shortage of logging going on in the Pacific Northwest right now. One issue that's been raised is early sterile habitats. American Bird Conservancy will often support creation of early sterile habitats to help conserve priority species. However, in this case, we do not believe that it is warranted. We recommend that the agency utilize natural disturbances. Simply refraining from post-fire logging has the potential to create abundant, high-quality, early sterile habitat in the region. We do not believe it's acceptable to convert any nesting, roosting, and foraging habitat of the northern spotted owl for this purpose. And again, when you look at our conservation framework, the needs of the endangered species need to take precedent. Under the Northwest Forest Plan, restoration of owl habitat, when it occurs, should hasten creation of owl habitat, not set it back by many decades, which is what would happen when regeneration is allowed. This provision is unrelated to owl recovery or sound forest management and should be removed from the final designation. The other issue that's been driving this debate has been the idea that the region has been hit with severe, high-intensity, catastrophic fires that just wipe everything out of their path and leave wildlife no hope. In fact, a close look at the evidence suggests that on the dry forest of the east side and in Northern California, there has not been an increase in severe, high-intensity fires. Most of the acres burned have been low to moderate severity with generally beneficial ecological effects. So we believe that the risk of fire to owls has been exaggerated in the recovery plan and the critical habitat rule, and that a closer look is clearly needed there. Active management in owl habitat has already taken place. Region 5 of the Forest Service has already moved ahead with this, and I think it gives an idea of where the draft critical habitat rule would take us, where it's supporting active management in owl critical habitat, including regeneration harvest in moist west side forests. The draft goes so far as to suggest that forest management goals can take precedence over owl conservation, and that the conservation of the species must be compatible with the broader landscape goals. We think that the agency actually has this backwards, and that the needs of the endangered species should be taking precedence. The approach of the agencies raised real concerns from the scientific societies. The Society for Conservation Biology, Wildlife Society, and Ornithologists Union have written that the proposed policy changes have the potential to adversely impact federal lands in the Northwest to the detriment of spotted owls and other federal listed species. And they're very concerned about adopting untested active management forestry technique. The groups are asking the Department of Interior to prepare an environmental impact statement to test active management forestry's impact on spotted owl populations prior to being used at a broader landscape level. We agree with this assessment and believe the land management agencies should conduct a joint EIS under the leadership of the Fish and Wildlife Service. The need for this research was identified a long time ago. Jack Ward Thomas, the former chief of the Forest Service, noted in the 1990 Interagency Science Report, found that logging had not been found to be compatible with maintaining suitable owl habitat, and the need for a precautionary approach that requires treatments to be proven before broadly implemented. Where this proposal really goes awry, we believe, is with this when you combine the active management with the adverse modification definition that's being proposed, it could really open up the door to potential abuse in the forest. The draft critical habitat rule states that if a project has considered ecological forestry principles, that in general these activities would not be considered adverse modification of owl habitat. As a result of this provision, the normal protections provided by critical habitat to address adverse modification may not apply at the discretion of the Fish and Wildlife Service. President Barack Obama issued a memorandum to Secretary of the Interior Ken Salazar endorsing the active management approach, stating that logging should be allowed and considered an acceptable practice in all northern spotted owl critical habitat. This has raised great concern from the scientists as well. They wrote a memo to the President stating that we're concerned that this memorandum overstates the quality and quantity of scientific research on the potential benefits of active forest management, especially in the Pacific Northwest on a federally listed species. In particular, they're unaware of any substantial literature that demonstrates that active forest management enhances the recovery of northern spotted owls. The draft identified nearly 14 million acres of potential critical habitat, a major increase in acreage, and we think that this is important recognition about the additional habitat needs to recover the species. The administration is recommending that some identified lands be exempted from critical habitat because they argue the lands are already being conserved or that conservation purposes can better be achieved through exclusion. A total of over 9 million acres would remain. We think that the exemptions deserve careful consideration. Normally we would be inclined to support them philosophically, but in the case of the northern spotted owl and given the management history of the region, we think closer scrutiny is needed. HCPs in the region have not been shown to be particularly effective at reducing owl take. We suggest that unless the agency can demonstrate compliance and some positive benefit to the owl from these agreements, that those exemptions should not be considered. The state of California is closing state parks. It's difficult to know that the conservation benefits are going to be assured under those kinds of circumstances. Similarly, we're seeing proposals to dispose of federal lands or de-designate protection for certain areas of federal lands. And so given this climate and the uncertainty that that creates, we don't see that these exclusions are generally warranted. When we look at the plan in its entirety, we have to conclude that, that in its totality, it's a timber-focused plan. Provisions in the draft plan encourage unproven thinning and forestry techniques. When you combine that with the expansive definition of adverse modification that allows degradation of owl habitat, we have the potential to see logging of areas that are now protected by the Northwest Forest Plan, including mature forests that the plan had intended to become old growth. These provisions, which were repeated numerous times in the draft, clearly intend to increase timber harvest in the region while providing the absolute minimum of habitat protection in terms of both total acreage by encouraging exclusions and with lax management standards weaker than the standards and guidelines of the Northwest Forest Plan. This language has the potential to allow excessive logging to the detriment of the northern spotted owl population and may foreclose owl recovery by not providing adequate late successional forest necessary to ensure high-quality owl habitat in the future. We believe some changes are needed, but we do think that there's hope that this can be fixed. Active management in owl habitat should be considered experimental and conducted on a small scale and monitored to determine its impact on northern spotted owls. The necessity and benefits of active management in owl habitat remain in dispute. We recommend the Fish and Wildlife Service lead the land management agencies in developing an environmental impact statement to devise a research strategy that addresses this question. The Northwest Forest Plan allows for management experiments in the designation of in the designated adaptive management areas, and we recommend that these projects be limited to those areas. The proposed definition of adverse modification of habitat is not supported by the best available science and should be taken out. We recommend that the standards and guidelines of the Northwest Forest Plan be used to preclude inappropriate and unsustainable management practices. And maintaining the reserves is really the most critical piece of that. And we do not believe that to date that the agency has really done enough to support real restoration of the young plantation lands that the Northwest Forest Plan intended to become old growth. The administration has also announced a new planning process for the BLM managed lands in Oregon that, based on the administration's press statements, appears to be a significant departure from the Northwest Forest Plan by encouraging regeneration in moist forest, which is not in the best interest of the owl or the needed expansion of the old growth forest ecosystem to provide for owl recovery. At the urging of the Forest Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service has already been laying the groundwork for elimination of the owl reserves east of the Cascade Crest by including language favorable to that approach in the owl recovery plan. This portion of the draft plan was criticized by peer reviewers, but in the final, their concerns were not addressed. The proposed Wenatchee Forest Plan revision would eliminate the existing owl reserves and open the forest to experimental logging. While the plan proposes a designated percentage of the forest will be managed for the owl's benefit, there will no longer be areas where the species protection is guaranteed. This proposal is not consistent with the Northwest Forest Plan, which provides reserves with guaranteed protections that cannot be lifted at the discretion of the local land managers. The proposal also significantly weakens other standards and guidelines, such as road density standards, which would be very detrimental to owl conservation. I'll briefly mention the barred owl has invaded northern spotted owl habitat. Modeling indicates that to allow for coexistence of the two species, additional habitat will need to be set aside for the northern spotted owl. The Fish and Wildlife Service is proposing experimental removal of barred owls to determine if spotted owl populations will benefit. We believe the agency has been doing a good job analyzing this problem. I participated on the barred owl stakeholder working group, and I think that they did a very good job of analyzing the issues and trying to identify potential pitfalls. It does look like there is likely to be opposition from animal rights groups to the experimental removal. And I'd also just like to briefly mention the marbled murrelet, another threatened bird species that depends on the old-growth ecosystem. One benefit of the Northwest Forest Plan is that it provides a conservation framework for many species. Minimizing protection for spotted owls is likely to have detrimental consequences for other listed species and water quality. Habitat loss on private lands continues to remain the greatest threat to the murrelet, and with the recent boom in exports from private lands, there is concern about a loss of their habitat in that situation. American Bird Conservancy is preparing comments on the Critical Habitat Plan and will be asking for stronger conservation measures to be incorporated and for the administration to reverse course and to strengthen rather than to weaken protection for the mature forests in the region that are needed to become old growth. Other steps that could be taken, we believe the owl should be downgraded to endangered status to reflect its current plight. Additional monitoring is needed to determine if conservation efforts are being effective and to understand the impacts of active management. We also believe that the United States should be more of a leader in protecting forests for climate change. The forests in the Northwest are incredibly powerful carbon reserves. A number of conservation groups actually asked this administration to conserve the forests in the Northwest as carbon reserves as part of our contribution to addressing global climate change. The United States is currently paying other countries to protect their forests, and so we thought it appropriate that we make some sort of contribution here at home. And so we're still hoping to see policies that will provide greater protection for these forests, particularly since they're under such regular threat. Lastly, I'd just like to thank you all for your time and attention. My name is Steve Holmer with American Bird Conservancy. I would be happy to answer any of your questions. Email is usually the best way to get me, sholmer@abcbirds.org. We also have additional information on our website at www.abcbirds.org. Thanks so much. Have a good day.